Section 14 of Recollections of a Busy Life by William B. Forwood. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. Directorships. The Overhead Railway. The Liverpool Dock Estate margins the Lancashire shore of the Mersey for 6 miles, and the offices of the ship owners and merchants, who have their business with the docks, are about the centre. In old days the difficulty of getting to and from the various docks was greatly increased by the crowded state of the adjacent streets. Buses ran along the dock lines of rails, but having frequently to pull up for traffic, they proved a very slow mode of conveyance, but notwithstanding this they carried 2.5 million passengers each year. The trade of the port was consequently greatly hindered by the want of rapid communication, and the expenses of the port were increased by the difficulty of moving large bodies of men about. Crews were delayed in getting to their ships, and stevedores and master porters lost the greater part of the day in going from dock to dock. Under such circumstances much pressure was brought to bear upon the Dock Board to construct a railway along the line of docks. In the end they obtained parliamentary powers, but for years they hesitated to proceed with the work. Some of us thought the Dock Board was unduly timid, and we felt that the trade of the port was being seriously hampered. We approached the Dock Board and offered to find the capital to construct the railway. The Dock Board agreed to our proposals, subject to terms, and Parliament approved the transfer of these powers to me as representing the directors of the proposed new overhead railway. In 1889 we issued a prospectus, the first directors being myself, chairman, Richard Hobson, Harold Brocklebank, George Robertson, Edward Lawrence, and James Barrow. Our capital was subscribed for twice over. We were fortunate in making our contracts for the ironwork, which we purchased at the lowest price ever known. Our first intention was to work the line with steam locomotives, but during the course of its construction we very seriously thought out the question of electric traction. There was much to deter us from adopting the new motive power. It had not been tried on a large scale, there were unknown risks and dangers, and the cost of the electric equipment would involve an additional outlay of £100,000. Nevertheless, we eventually decided to adopt electric traction, laying down as a fundamental principle that everything should be of the best, and that we should try as few experiments as possible. We were fortunate in having Sir Douglas Fox and Mr. Francis Fox as our engineers, and Mr. Cottrell as their local representative. We had many difficulties. The Dock Board, very foolishly I think, refused to allow us to make our structure strong enough to carry goods traffic. The corporation declined to allow us to carry our line along the foot of St. Nicholas churchyard and through the back Goree, and so avoid our unsightly structure crossing St. Nicholas Place and destroying one of the most beautiful sights and vistas in Liverpool. I have often been upbraided in the council for this, but nobody could have done more than I did to avoid it, and the entire responsibility lies at the door of the Health Committee, of which Mr. Hawley was at that time the chairman. Neither the Dock Board nor the corporation was sympathetic to our undertaking. The former called upon us to remake the entire line of dock railway at a cost of £60,000, and the Health Committee, for the privilege of moving one of our columns a few inches outside our parliamentary limits, required us to repave Wapping at a cost of £8,000. Opening by the Marquis of Salisbury. Early in 1893 the railway was completed and ready for opening, and the Marquis of Salisbury, then Prime Minister, kindly undertook to perform the opening ceremony. The opening was fixed for the 3rd of February. Lord Salisbury arrived from London the night before, and came direct to my house at Blundellsands. We had a large house party to meet him, including the first Earl of Latham, Sir William Cooper, Mr. Walter Long, Lord Kelvin, and a number of electrical experts. The National Telephone Company kindly connected the dinner table with the various theatres in Manchester and in London, and at 10 o'clock each guest took a little receiver from under the cloth and enjoyed listening to the various performances at the theatres, where the pantomimes were still running. The telephone company had laid special direct wires from my house to the trunk wires from Liverpool, so that the telephonic communications were very clear and distinct. On a side table was placed a special instrument for Lord Salisbury, which was connected directly with the House of Commons. He went to it, and taking up the receiver, spoke to Mr. Sidney Herbert, who gave him a report on the progress of the debate on the address. Lord Salisbury was both surprised and delighted, and said, "I can hear someone talking about Uganda." It was the first time the House of Commons was ever connected by telephone. The next morning we drove down to the generating station of the Overhead, escorted by mounted police. Lord Salisbury started the engines, and then rode in a special train from one end of the line to the other, and afterwards we adjourned to the town hall for luncheon. He was apparently delighted with the function, and said it was a great pleasure to him to meet scientific men. He was very well up in the details of electric traction, and minutely examined every part of our machinery. A few days after he wrote expressing the pleasure the visit had given him. He said, "I thank you heartily for a very interesting evening and day at the end of last week. I hate political functions, but this was a very different occasion. It was one of the most interesting 24 hours I have passed." Thus was opened the first full-gauged electric railway in the world, and I am glad to think that electrically it has been an unqualified success and has proved a great benefit to the trade of the port. The railway carried in 1908 9.5 million passengers. It also promised to be a good property for our shareholders. Our dividend gradually increased. We had paid 5%, and were well within sight of 6%, when the whole circumstances of our dock traffic were changed by the corporation introducing electricity into the working of their tramway system, and extending their lines so as to parallel the Overhead Railway. We also suffered from the introduction of the telephone, and from the substitution of steamers for sailing ships, and of large steamers for small steamers, all tending to reduce the number of men employed about the docks. Still I hope and believe there is a future for our little railway, but it is heartbreaking work to run a railway which does not earn a dividend. We have had many important people to visit our railway, affording as it does an excellent view of the docks, and we have always arranged a special train for their conveyance. Among others whom I have had the honour of escorting over the line are the present King and Queen, when Prince and Princess of Wales. Our most amusing and difficult visitor was the Shahzada of Afghanistan. He had no idea of the value of time, and when we arrived at the end of our journey he called for his doctor, and then for his apothecary, and it was useless my trying to impress upon his A.D.C. that the whole traffic of the line was being stopped while His Highness took a pill. The Bank of Liverpool. I was elected a director of the Bank of Liverpool in 1888, and became the chairman in 1898. It was during my chairmanship that the old bank in Water Street was pulled down and the new bank built, which I had the privilege of opening. I also initiated and conducted the negotiation for the purchase of Wakefield Crewdson's Bank in Kendal. The Cunard Company. I was elected a member of the board of directors of the Cunard Company in 1888, and found the work of looking after a great and progressive steamship company to be extremely interesting. For 2 years I was the deputy chairman. I resigned this position as it required almost continual attendance at the Cunard offices, which I could not, with all my other engagements, possibly give. To have been identified with the most forward policy in the shipping world has always been a source of great pride and pleasure to me. A few years after I joined the board, we built the Lucania and Campania, steamers of 13,000 tons and 27,000 horsepower with a speed of 22 knots. They were, in size and in speed, a long way ahead of any steamer afloat, and created very general and great interest. At the Jubilee Naval Review in 1897, held in the Solent, a small steamer made her appearance. She was little more than a big launch, and was called the Turbinia. She was propelled by a steam turbine, and attained an extraordinary speed. We little thought when we saw this boat rushing about at a great speed, that she would create a revolution in the mode of using steam for high-speed vessels. In 1905 the Germans placed in the Atlantic trade several vessels which steamed 23 and 23½ knots, which secured for them the blue riband of the Atlantic. About the same time the White Star fleet and other Atlantic lines were bought by an American combine, and it appeared as if the whole Atlantic trade was destined to pass into the hands of the Germans and Americans. The country was much excited at the prospect, and pressure was brought upon the government to assist the Cunard Company, and thus to preserve to the country the premier line of Atlantic steamers. The government offered to lend the Cunard Company the money necessary to build 2 steamers of 24½ knots speed, and to grant to them a subsidy of £150,000 per annum. These terms being accepted, the Cunard Company had then to determine the style both of boat and engines which would best fulfil the conditions of the contract. Engines indicating 60,000 and 70,000 horsepower were considered necessary for a vessel to attain the guaranteed speed, and this power with reciprocating engines would involve shafting of dangerous size. Hence it was decided to appoint a committee of experts to make enquiry as to the working of the Parsons turbines in some Channel steamers, which were already fitted with this new form of engine. After a prolonged consideration, the committee reported in favour of turbine engines. Meantime, experimental models of hull forms had been made and tested in the tanks belonging to the government, to ascertain the lines which would give the necessary displacement, and be the most easily propelled. It was eventually decided to build ships of 780 feet in length, by 86 feet beam, having a gross register of 34,000 tons, with turbine engines indicating 70,000 horsepower. The order for one of these ships, the Lusitania, was placed on the Clyde with Messrs. John Brown and Company, for the other, the Mauretania, with Messrs. Swan, Hunter and Company, at Newcastle. The planning of the cabins and the furnishing and decorating of these steamers gave us much thought, as we were anxious they should be a distinct advance on anything yet produced. These ships have fully realized all our expectations, the Mauretania having completed 4 round trips across the Atlantic at an average speed of over 25 knots. On one voyage she averaged over 26 knots, on a consumption of 1,000 tons of coal per day, and on another voyage she made an average speed out and home of 25.75 knots. The Britannia, the first ship of the Cunard Company, built in 1840, was only 1,139 tons, with a speed of 8½ knots. Vibration. An amusing incident occurred in connection with the building of the Campania. On her engine trial she vibrated excessively, even dangerously, breaking some stanchions and deck plating. It was decided to ask Lord Kelvin, then Sir William Thomson, to investigate the cause of the vibration, and I was deputed to attend him upon the necessary trials on the Clyde. After several days' trials, Sir William announced that the vibration would all disappear if the ship was loaded down. 3,000 tons of coal were put on board, and a large party of guests were invited for the trial trip. It was arranged that the ship should upon this trip start at a slow speed, at which there was no vibration, and when the guests were seated at lunch, the directors were to quietly come on deck and the ship be put at full speed. This was no sooner done than she began to shake from stem to stern so violently that the whole of the guests streamed on deck inquiring what was the matter, and the speed of the ship had to be reduced. The vibration was afterwards cured by following the suggestion of our old Scotch engineer and altering the pitch of the screws, so that their revolutions did not synchronize with the vibratory period of the ship. Some few years after this event, I was invited to dine one Sunday evening at Balliol College, Oxford. After dinner I was taken into an adjoining room to wine by the president, Professor Cairns, well known as a great philosophical thinker and writer. On passing out of the dining hall, a friend whispered to me, "I am sorry for you. The president never utters a word to his guest." We sat at a small table vis-à-vis. I tried to draw the president into conversation on several subjects, but failed lamentably. Eventually I asked him if he knew Lord Kelvin. He at once said he was an old friend, whereupon I told him the story of my experience on the Campania. He became quite excited and interested. On leaving the room my friend, who was a don on the classical side, again came up to me and asked what we had been talking about. I answered, "Vibration." He replied, "What is that? I never saw the president so interested and so excited before." Castle Weems. In connection with the building of the Campania, I have a pleasing recollection of a visit to Castle Weems, on the Clyde, the residence of the then chairman of the Cunard Company, Mr. John Burns. Mr. Burns took me to call upon his father, Sir George Burns, who resided at Weems House. He was then a very old man, over 90 years of age, and as he lay upon his bed he looked very picturesque, with his handsome aquiline features and his snow-white locks resting upon the pillow. He told me with evident pride of the early days of the Cunard Company, of which he was one of the founders, the others being Mr. Cunard of Halifax, Mr. Charles MacIver of Liverpool, and his brother Mr. David MacIver, and he narrated his recollections of the old sailing brigs which used to convey the mails to Halifax before the days of steamships. Sir George died soon after my visit, and was succeeded in his baronetcy by his son, Mr. John Burns, who, at the Diamond Jubilee of the Queen, in 1897, was created a peer, Lord Inverclyde. He died in 1901, and was succeeded by his son George, who died in 1905, after holding the title only a few years, and was succeeded by his brother James, the present peer. The second Lord Inverclyde, who was also chairman of the Cunard Company, was a man of conspicuous ability, with a big grasp of affairs. It was he who carried through the agreement with the government, which resulted in the building of the Mauretania and Lusitania. During these negotiations he displayed so much energy, tact, and knowledge of shipping, that had he lived he was marked out for high position in the government. It has been my privilege during the 22 years I have been a director of the Cunard Company to serve under 5 chairmen: the first Lord Inverclyde, Mr. Jardine; the second Lord Inverclyde, Mr. Watson, and Mr. Booth. The Liverpool and Mediterranean Trade. Sir George Burns' reference to the making of the Cunard Company brings to my mind the story told by my father-in-law, William Miles Moss, of the beginnings of the Mediterranean steamship trade, which has made for Liverpool people so many great fortunes. He said that his firm, James Moss and Company, Vienna Chappell and Company, and John Bibby and Sons were engaged in the Mediterranean trade, which they conducted with sailing schooners and brigs. In 1848 he thought the time had arrived to replace these by steamers, and his firm chartered a paddle steamer, which traded to the Isle of Man, for an experimental voyage to the Mediterranean. She made a most successful voyage to Genoa, Leghorn, etc., and he was so encouraged that he made a contract to build a screw steamer for the Egyptian trade to cost £21,000. Mr. Moss invited the heads of the firms I have named to dinner at his house, in Lower Breck Road, and told them what he had done, and asked them to take shares in his new venture, and then passed a paper round the table that they might write down the interest they were willing to take. It was returned to him with only £12,000 subscribed. He said, "I told them they were a shabby lot, and that I would take the balance." This was the first steamer built to trade between Liverpool and Alexandria. Mr. Moss was a very shrewd, long-sighted man, and for years was the moving spirit in the Mediterranean steamship trade, being largely interested in Bibby's as well as being the principal owner of the fleet of James Moss and Company. He was for many years a member of the Dock Board, in which he was followed by his son and his grandson. The White Star Line. The making of the White Star Line must always remain an interesting incident in the history of our commerce. In the 60s the Atlantic trade was in the hands of the Cunard, the Inman, the National, and the Guion companies. At this time the Bibby line of Mediterranean steamers had been most successful. One of the principal owners in these steamers was Mr. Schwab, whose nephew, Mr. Wolfe, had just started in business as a shipbuilder in Belfast, in partnership with Mr. Harland. Mr. T. H. Ismay had recently formed a partnership with Mr. William Imrie, and had taken over the business of the White Star Line, then engaged in owning sailing ships employed in the Australian trade. The story at this time was that during a game of billiards at Mr. Schwab's house in West Derby, Mr. Schwab proposed to Mr. Imrie that his firm should start another line of steamers to New York, adopting as their type the models which had proved so very profitable in the Mediterranean trade, and offered if they were built by Messrs. Harland and Wolfe to find the greater part of the capital. The scheme thus inaugurated quickly took shape. Mr. G. H. Fletcher associated himself with the project, and the first White Star steamer, the Oceanic, was built, followed quickly by the Celtic, Baltic, Germanic, and Britannic. The steamers were the first vessels constructed with their cabin accommodation amidships, where there is the least motion and vibration. This proved a very attractive feature. Mr. Ismay also took a personal interest in studying the comfort of the travellers by his line, which quickly became very popular. Mr. Ismay lived to see the debut of his masterpiece, the Oceanic, the second of this name, but had passed away in 1899, before the White Star Line became a part of the great American steamship combine. Mr. T. H. Ismay. Mr. Ismay was a remarkable man. He was of a very retiring disposition, but had great strength of character. With an aptitude for organization, he was able to select good men to assist him, and to obtain from them the best of their work. Mr. Ismay was one of the ablest men of my time. He declined all honours, and found his pleasure in surrounding himself with beautiful pictures and objets d'art in his home at Dawpool, and he was not unmindful of others, for he founded the Seamen's Pension Fund, to which he was a large contributor. To commemorate the Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1887, and Her Majesty's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, grand reviews of the fleet took place at Spithead. Mr. Ismay invited a large party of his Liverpool friends on board the Teutonic on both of the occasions, to see the reviews. At Spithead the Teutonic was joined by a large and very distinguished company from London, comprising many of Her Majesty's ministers, the leaders of the opposition, and men renowned in literature, science, and art. At the first review the German Emperor and the Prince of Wales came on board, and spent some time inspecting the ship, and especially her armament. Other Atlantic liners had on board the members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. These reviews were very successful, the great array of battleships being imposing and impressive, although we could not avoid remarking their small size compared with the Teutonic, Campania, and other liners present. The Teutonic strips will be for long remembered for the munificent manner in which Mr. Ismay entertained his guests, and the perfection of all the arrangements. Sir Alfred Jones, K.C.M.G. The late Sir Alfred Jones is another of our great shipowners whose career conveys many striking lessons. Enthusiastic about everything he put his hand to, intense in his application to work, and resourceful in finding out the ways and means to success, he had one fault not uncommon in forceful men: he had not the power of delegation. He would do everything himself, and the strain was more than even his robust nature could stand. On my asking him a few weeks before he died why he did not take a partner, he replied, "I will do so when I can find a man as intense as myself." As indicating his resourcefulness, when he found bananas were not selling freely in Liverpool, he brought down a number of hawkers from London with their barrows, and peddled his fruit about the streets. On my suggesting to him that he would make nothing of Jamaica, on account of the lazy habits of the negro, he replied, "I will change all that. I will send out a lot of Scotchmen." When he travelled to London he was always accompanied by 2 clerks, to whom he dictated letters en route. Every moment of his time was filled up, he told me. "My work is done on a timetable. A certain hour each day I devote to my steamers, another to my oil mills, another to my hotels, and so on." Sir Alfred Jones' name will, however, ever dwell with us as the founder and most active supporter of the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, which has destroyed the ravages of yellow fever and made the malarial and waste places of the world habitable. End of section 14.